On this episode of Create, Consume, Repeat, I revisit Conan the Barbarian, a film chock full of muscles, magic, and romance. Hell, the only thing better than this episode is...
Crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentation of their women.
Created by Robert E. Howard, Conan would make his first appearance in the short story The Phoenix on the Sword, published on December 1932 in Weird Tales. But I argue that a short story titled The Shadow Kingdom, written 3 years earlier, would be equally important, since it not only started the sword and sorcery literary genre by blending elements of fantasy, horror, and mythology with historical romance, action, and swordplay. It would also provide many of the elements used in the feature film. And yes, I am aware that the Shadow Kingdom didn't feature Conan himself, but instead his barbarian precursor, Kull. And let's be honest, without Kull, there might not have been a Conan the Barbarian. In the early 1980s, films like Dragon Slayer and Excalibur would popularize the sword and sorcery genre in film, but it wasn't until the release of Conan the Barbarian in May of 1982 that it would go mainstream. Conan would not only redefine the sword and sorcery film genre, it would set the standard by which all fantasy films would be judged up until the release of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. And that just says something about the love and craftsmanship poured into this movie when you consider the long list of sword and sorcery films released, like Beastmaster, Red Sonja, Legend, one of my favorites, and Willow, to name a few. So how was Conan able to defy all the odds and go on to become such an important film? Well, it's thanks to the incredible amount of talent in front and behind the lens. And to be very honest, it's a level of talent you normally don't find working in this genre. Originally written by Edward Summer and Roy Thomas, then totally rewritten by Oliver Stone, the visionary writer-director that gave us an unflinching look at the atrocities of Vietnam, a perfect snapshot of 1980s greed, and a film that would cause a nation to re-examine JFK's assassination. Oliver Stone's film adaptation of Conan could best be described as a grand fantasy-filled fever dream, born of drugs.
Oliver had already written the script, and I read it and it was really inspirational, probably because it was so insane.
Obviously, his vision would prove too expensive and difficult to realize, which caused major studios to pass on the project, which in turn forced executive producer Edward R. Pressman to sell the project to Dino De Laurentiis, who would hire John Milius to rewrite and direct Conan. This, my friends, is a pivotal moment, since John Milius is a man so badass. Martin Scorsese, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, and Francis Ford Coppola revere the man and his ability to write. Just watch the USS Indianapolis scene in Jaws, which Milius dictated over the phone.
Lifeless eyes, black eyes like a doll's eyes.
Over the phone! Still not convinced? Watch Apocalypse Now.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
Milius would inject a sense of place and history never seen in the genre and pull a great deal of inspiration from the Shadow Kingdom, whose plot revolves around serpent men, an ancient pre-human race who were almost extinct and ruled from the shadows using their snake cult religion and ability to disguise themselves with magic. Sounds a hell of a lot like Thulsa Doom, don't you think? And while we're on the topic of casting, let's not ignore the 800-pound gorilla in the room, Arnold Schwarzenegger, the living embodiment of Robert E. Howard's Conan, drawn by Frank Frazetta. A relative unknown to Hollywood, Arnold would not only deliver an amazing performance, he would go on to be one of Hollywood's greatest action heroes, kicking the shit out of humans, aliens, robots, and even state laws. But even the great Conan the Barbarian needed help from an all-star ensemble cast that included Jerry Lopez as Subutai, Mako Iwamatsu as Akito the Wizard, Sandal Bergman as Valeria, the reason a generation of nerds fell in love with Valkyries, and proof that Hollywood does have strong female characters. You just have to know where to look, right, Ripley? And if that weren't enough, Milius was able to convince Max von Sydow to play King Osric.
Seeking for the truth of her soul, as if I could not give it to her.
Gives me chills every time I see that scene. Pure acting genius. And while on the topic of genius, let's talk about Thulsa Doom. Played by James Earl Jones, Thulsa Doom is easily one of cinema's greatest villains. Don't agree? I guess killing and pillaging a whole village within the first 5 minutes of the film just to solve the riddle of steel ain't shit. Conan would not only have a killer cast, it would also rely on Ron Cobb to bring the Hyborian Age to life, a place sometime after the sinking of Atlantis and before the beginning of recorded ancient history. Just look at these sketches of Conan's sword, the Mountain of Power, the Tree of Woe from Oliver Stone's script, which was taken straight out of A Witch Shall Be Born, and of course the now famous Two Snakes sigil. And if the name Ron Cobb rings a bell, well, that's because he worked on Star Wars and Alien. Let that sink in. Star Wars and Alien. This dude's body of work is incredible. With all that said, no look back at Conan would be complete without gushing over Basil Polidorus' operatic score that carries much of the emotion in this sparsely dialogued film. It's a masterpiece that is ingrained in our psyche, so much so that you're probably already hearing the war drums in your head. And for those that wonder why I would devote a whole episode to a sword and sorcery film, well, it's simple. Conan is an enduring classic that is firmly grounded in the traditions of Western heroic mythology. It's the embodiment of Nietzsche's übermensch, a character that we, the audience, can't help but root for, kind of like Rocky. Hell, Schwarzenegger himself regarded Conan as the new Rocky, telling the New York Post that the picture is a winner because Conan himself is a winner. He's the kind of person an audience can identify with. He never gives up. Ultimately, Conan the film as we know it could only be born of Milius, since it's interwoven with his views on politics, philosophy, and maybe even his DNA, which is what makes Milius' body of work so fascinating. From his love of American exceptionalism on full display in The Wind and the Lion,
American grizzly bear is a symbol of the American character. Strength, intelligence, ferocity, a little blind and reckless at times, but courageous beyond all doubt.
to his shrewd yet polarizing Cold War commie-killing propaganda masterpiece, Red Dawn.
Wolverines!
That wraps up this episode, and if you want more content like this, let me know all about it in the comments section below. And don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and bell button. It lets me know you're enjoying the content on this channel and gives me the feels. Catch you guys next time.